Hi, I'm Gareth Green and welcome to Voice Leading Tips, episode 5. Yes, we have a series of 12 videos on the matter of voice leading. So just some quick tips on things to think about when you're writing harmony, writing chords, dealing with melodic lines in music and so on. So what's this one about? Well, it's about this. When we're writing 4-part tonal harmony, in other words, in a key with 4 different voices, generally speaking, and this is a generalization, but generally speaking, try to double the root when you're in a root position chord. Okay, let's have a think about this. So what we've got here is a chord of C major. So a chord of C major is C, E, and G. It has a root, a third, and a fifth. So C is the root of that chord, the bottom note of that chord. So of course, when I look at a triad like this, I've only got 3 notes, C, E, G. But if I'm writing 4-part harmony, well, one of those notes is going to have to come twice. So this is all about doubling notes. So which notes should we double? Which one shouldn't we do? This is something that causes a lot of confusion. So what I'm saying is, when you're in a root position chord, in other words, we're using a chord of C major with C at the bottom, generally speaking, double the root. Okay, so you see the first example I've got here. I've got a C here, I've got an E here, I've got a G there, and I'm doubling the C at the top. It sounds a pretty good balance of a chord. So by doubling the root, we've kind of reaffirmed the root of the chord. So you see how that one works. Now, it doesn't have to be doubled at the top. In the second example, I've got the same chord. I've got my C, E, G chord with those notes kind of reorganized. Now I'm doubling the C, but I'm putting it in the tenor part instead of in the soprano part. So what does that one sound like? So you can hear that sort of sounds all right, doesn't it? So that's what we're doing there. Okay, well, that's how it works in root position chords. Now, when we're dealing with first inversion chords, first of all, what do I mean by that? Well, if I've got a C major chord, a C, E, G, and C is at the bottom of that chord, we say it's in root position. But if I have the same chord, but with E at the bottom, E, maybe with G and C or some other organization of the upper notes, well, I've still got C, E, and G, but this time E is the lowest note of the chord. So if I have something like that, that's a first inversion chord. Okay, so what do I do then in first inversion chords? Generally speaking, and again, it's generally, double the root or double the fifth. Okay, let's have a look at an example of each of those. So here's the C major chord again, the C, E, G chord. I've got E in the bass, C in the tenor, G in the alto part. I'm doubling the C at the top, so I'm doubling the root. Here it sounds perfectly all right. In this second example, I've got the same C major first inversion chord, but this time I'm doubling the fifth, the G. That also sounds okay, doesn't it? Now, this is just telling us to try, if we can, to avoid doubling major thirds. So if I've got a major chord with a root, a third, and a fifth, the third will be a major third above that bottom note, above that root note of the original triad, and we try to avoid doubling that major third. So if I take that first inversion chord, for example, if we take this chord, but instead of putting that G at the top, I put an E at the top, well, that's a major third, that's a major third. So that would mean doubling the major third. It would sound like this. Now, does that sound bad? Not particularly, but the theory is that if you double a major third, it tends to dominate the chord. And there is a sense in which you can hear those 2 E's shouting at us a little bit and slightly kind of clouding the other 2 notes. So it's interesting, you can double the root of the chord, and even though it's obviously giving some prominence to the root of the chord, well, that's okay, isn't it? Because it's the bottom of the chord. You can double the fifth, that still sounds all right. As soon as you double the third, doesn't sound bad, but somehow those major thirds start to shout at us. a little bit. So we try to avoid doubling major thirds in exactly the same way that if we're looking at our first example in root position, instead of having that C doubled at the top, I could have decided to double the E. Well, of course, that would give us a double major third there. So that would sound like this. It's not a bad sound. There's nothing horrible about it particularly, but that major third is starting to dominate the chord. So this is the theory. Once you're in more than 4 parts, it's much easier to double the major thirds because you're also doubling other notes. So it sort of puts the chord back in balance again. But that's generally speaking the theory on this one. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, he's talking about root position chords and he's talking about first inversion chords. Why is he not talking about second inversion chords? Well, we could do the same thing would apply if it was a second inversion C major chord, C, E, G. It would simply have G at the bottom. Okay, but all I'm saying is that the same thing applies. Don't double a major third. You know, if you've got something like that, it's just a kind of shouting major third at us. So try not to do that. There are specific things to know about second inversion chords, which we'll come back to in another video. But most of the time, you're living in a world of root position and first inversion chords. And one of the issues that a lot of people struggle with is, okay, I get the thing about chords, you know, I get the triad thing and how that works. Maybe I get the root position and first inversion thing. But when it comes to kind of like, okay, if I'm in 4 parts, I need to double one of the notes. Which note do I double? So this is just trying to offer general advice. That's all it is. And you might find many exceptions to this. That's fine. But this is a safe route. So all I'm saying, in 4-part tonal harmony in a major key or a minor key, generally double the root when you're using a root position chord, generally double the root or the fifth when you're using a first inversion chord, and do what you can to avoid doubling major thirds. It's perfectly okay to double minor thirds. So what I've got here is a chord of A minor and it's in first inversion. So A minor is A, C, E, but C is the lower sounding note. That's the third of that chord. And I've got a C in the bass and a C at the top. So here's A minor, first inversion with a double third, but this is a minor third. And you can hear that somehow slightly more mellow than doubling a major third. The minor third is somehow a little bit easier to deal with, you know, on the ear. So double minor thirds, try not to double major thirds. So I hope that just gives you 1 or 2 clues as to this whole business of taking a 3-part triad, turning it into a 4-part chord and answering the question, oh, well, which of these notes should come twice in the chord in order to give me the 4 parts? So general advice there, don't take it as absolutely kind of solid truth because there are always exceptions. You'll always find examples in music that break that code, but this is the safest way of going about dealing with this issue. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, and doubtless you're a practicing musician, otherwise, you know, you might not be watching the video in the first place. I wonder how much of your life you spend practicing, and I wonder how effective your practice is, because we have a course entitled Effective Practice. Now, whether you spend 5 minutes a day practicing your instrument or whether you spend hours a day practicing your instrument, well, what's the best way to practice? You might be thinking, well, what does he mean? Because I just start playing the piece and, you know, hopefully it gets better every time I play it. Yeah, it's one way of doing it. But actually, it's great if you can have some kind of method behind how you practice. How can you practice things in such a way that it's actually going to improve? What are all the steps that you should be thinking about? Well, have a look at www.mmcourses.co.uk, scroll down the courses until you come to Effective Practice. Just looking through the headlines that are listed there, you'll be able to see all the ingredients of that course. And a number of people who've done that course have written to us to say, oh, wow, that has completely revolutionized the way I go about my practice. And I've made such marvelous progress since I've got some of this methodology into the way I practice. Anyway, there it is. Have a look. Lots of other things there as well. www.mmcourses.co.uk.